Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I am your host, Kyle. And today I have a topic that I think everyone's going to be kind of familiar with, kind of at least a little bit, hopefully just in large swaths at least, kind of big overarching. I'm certain you've heard of it. So what I'm talking about today is serfdom. And before we jump into serfdom, what it is, how it works, and all of that, I want to kind of clarify something and talk about something that's not necessarily 100% linked to this, but that I think there is overlap on and needs to be addressed. And that is the way that people view Russia. I'm actually going to be doing an episode very soon on popular conceptions of Russia, particularly throughout time. So we'll get to a little bit more of that later, get a little bit more into it there. But for now, I just kind of want to address the fact that the next hour or so is going to be me talking about how Russia did some really, really fucked up shit. How Russia created, on purpose, very deliberately, a very disgusting and dangerous system that would completely control and abuse millions of people over the course of about 300 years. And this really plays into the kind of conception that a lot of people have of Russia being despotic and backwards and evil and gross. Now, to be fair, the Russian Empire, the government, and all the people who made it work are pretty disgusting and evil and gross. But Russia as a culture, Russian people as a group, they are not necessarily indicative of that. And I want to make that clear because a lot of people do have and probably will continue to point at serfdom as kind of proof that, look, the Russians are backwards. They are kind of inherently despotic. They are inherently authoritarian. And that is not true. Serfdom will exist from about the 1540s to the 1860s. So for about 300 years. During that time, basically every other country on the planet will have a form of slavery, not the least of which including the United States. So, this is not to say that the Russians are perfect and amazing and there's nothing wrong. No, none of that. And it is also not to say that this is not some kind of unique evil that, oh, well, it doesn't matter because there are other forms of slavery somewhere else. No. If you ever hear anyone say that, you can just go ahead and bop them in the head. They're being dumb. Don't actually do that, but if you did, I wouldn't care. They're being dumb. And that's not at all what I'm saying. Slavery in all of its incarnations is evil, and every person who has ever or will ever engage in it is evil. But what I am trying to say is that Russian culture, the Russian people, Slavs in general, are not any more evil or heartless or cruel or backwards or stupid than any other culture that has ever existed. Because every other culture has done shit like this. This is one very specific example of cruelty, of evil, of gross, backwards, dumb-headed thinking. Do not let this be something that becomes indicative of all Russians. And you might be thinking, wow, you're really kind of making a big deal about this. And you're right, I am. Because anti-Slavic, anti-Russian racism is real. It's something that has existed for hundreds of years and continues to exist to this day. And it's really not that hard to see if you go looking for it. You will see to this day when people talk about the Russians, they go, well, the Russians are just subservient. You know, as a culture, they just like to be controlled. They just like despotism. They're just kind of inherently cruel. They're just inherently whatever. We have lots of negative things that we argue Slavs and Russians are just kind of that way. But that's all made up. It's all dumb. So, while this is absolutely going to be a discussion of some terrible, terrible stuff that the Russian Empire did, I do not want anyone to walk away from here going, wow, what amazing proof that Russia as like a whole place and as a people are indicative of this. No, that is not the case. But now that I have gotten that kind of disclaimer out there, let's go ahead and jump right into the history of serfdom. So first, what we need to talk about is slavery. So slavery existed in Russia before there was Russia. Like, slavery has been going on in this area of the planet for basically ever. I imagine it would be pretty much impossible to go find the first time that slavery was happening. So that's where we're starting off at. But this kind of slavery is different than serfdom. Serfdom is absolutely a form of bondage. It is a form of forced labor. But it is different than kind of your traditional, I guess, slavery. So in serfdom, you are not strictly speaking owned if you are a serf. If you're a serf, you are a part of the land. You are tied to the land. And the person who owns the land has control over you. So realistically, you might be going, what's the difference between slavery and serfdom? And on the ground, there isn't. There is basically no real difference. But kind of academically, they are two different systems in how they work. And for our purposes, the number one biggest difference between pre-serfdom slavery and serfdom is government control. Slavery was a very individual to individual thing. If you were an enslaver and you had your enslaved people, you could more or less do whatever you wanted with them. Once serfdom became a thing, if you were a landlord, there were rules about what you could do with your serfs and how. So that's the main difference. And this kind of government control is a slow rolling process and eventually would overtake slavery. But we will get there in a little bit. So for now, we're going to talk about the 1400s. The 1400s is where the concept of serfdom really begins to take shape as something different than slavery. And how this began was peasants, free peasants, were given obedience charters by the state so that they could live and farm on state land. So basically, at this time, the state might control some territory that's, governed by some part of the government. And if I'm a peasant and I say, hey, that's nice land over there, it's better than the land that I'm on, I could sign an obedience charter saying that basically you can tell me to do whatever you want. In exchange, I get to be on this land and I can have a little bit more stability. And this was originally set up so that officers in the military could have people to farm their land while they were off on campaign. Basically, the government was handing out land oftentimes to military people, but also to other functionaries of the government, and this would be state land. And so I would sign an obedience charter with whoever it was who owned this land, whatever military or state official was in charge. And then I would work the land while they were off doing whatever else it was that they would do. And this was in response to a lot of these people were complaining, hey, when we're off fighting wars or in court at Moscow or whatever, we can't make any money. So the government says, okay, you can bring these people in, they'll farm on the land, so while you're off doing whatever, these people will make money for you. And all throughout the 1400s and the 1500s, the state continued to centralize, and it created more and more strict land control. So remember, Ivan IV comes to power in 1547, and with him comes the beginning of a unified Russian state with a proper state bureaucracy. So a big part of him creating a centralized Russian state is creating a government-controlled, government-sponsored economy, which is built on serfdom. And in order to continue to build up the system of serfdom, in 1565, Ivan IV changed obedience charters so that they could state that the peasants were obligated by law to obey their landlords. And this is where serfdom really becomes put on paper. Before this, serfdom existed. Like, of course we talked about obedience charters and all that, but they weren't technically any rules saying that if you were a serf, you were obligated to do what your landlord said. Of course, that's how it happened, but that was kind of more de facto. Now it's de jure. This is how the system exists on paper. And the rest of the 1500s would see a continuation of a tightening on peasants' rights and a further kind of establishment and centralization of the system of serfdom. And a really big part of this would be tightening down the ability for the peasants to move. The peasants are tied to the land and cannot leave without the permission of the landlord or the state. And you might think, wow, there you go. That's more or less serfdom in and of itself. These people don't have any rights to go anywhere, and they don't have any rights to do what they want. Yes, but this actually isn't really that much about serfdom in this one instance. This control is actually a little bit more about just the government having, well, control. And what they're really trying to do is make tax collection, census counts, and conscription easier. It's kind of just an added bonus that this makes serfdom really into what it is. But serfdom isn't done yet. It's still kind of cooking in a way. It will continue to become more and more central to the Russian economy, and it will become more and more established as a system. And that's an important thing to note. Because as I said before, the main difference between this and slavery is slavery doesn't have a lot of rules. Serfdom is all rules. And a lot of it actually has less to do with the idea of creating serfdom as an institution. Granted, that is, of course, a big part of it. But a lot of it is also just about controlling the people and even controlling the landlords. It's all about just putting it on paper. That's something that the Russian government is going to struggle with always. Russia's just such a big place. There's so many people that the Russian government basically decides the easiest way to control or even just kind of monitor and know about everyone is to limit all of the rights of anyone that we can, which is going to eventually become basically anyone who isn't wealthy. That being said, there are going to be certain restrictions placed on those in charge, placed on landlords, gentry, stuff like that. And this is actually part of the decision to make it harder, really to make it impossible, for peasants to move. Because not only does it make it easier to see who's living on a certain area for taxation or draft purposes, and not only is it easier to centralize the workforce, it also reduces the conflict between landlords over serfs. Since these serfs aren't legally allowed to go anywhere, that potentially being to another landlord, without the permission of the previous one, well then, it cuts down on the competition between the landlords over what is now a very, very valuable human resource. That being said, serfs could still be bought and sold. Though the serfs weren't entirely locked in, they did have some ability to move. In particular, they were allowed to go from the land controlled by individual landlords onto state-controlled land that is directly governed by the government. That is, if they could pay the fee that was required for them to do so. And a lot of times when people could, they did. Because being on state-owned, state-controlled land was generally better than staying with their landlords. And it actually has a lot less to do with the fact like, oh, you have rights. Like, no, you still had like no rights. Mostly it's that if I live here with my landlord, they're right there and they have a lot more control over me, as opposed to, well, the government still technically has a lot of control over me, but, you know, they gotta come actually find me to make me do anything. So you don't really have more rights, but you have less oversight, I guess is kind of the best way to say it. But this would not really matter all too much because the government is still very into serfdom. Particularly as we get into the 16 and 1700s, things start to get very, very serfy for the Russian government. And what this really boils down to is the 16 and 1700s is a huge time of expansion for the Russian Empire, especially into the West, into places like Poland, Ukraine, because this is very, very fertile land. This is some of the most fertile land on the planet, and there's a lot of it. And not only is there a lot of it, there's a good number of people here too. Unlike when the Russian Empire expands into Siberia, you are going to have a lot less of a very dense population, moving in the west, there are going to be large cities. There are going to be lots of people. And this new land is going to come with those new people. And the Tsar would start doling out this land to whoever they liked. These would be people that are loyal to the Tsar, military commanders, whatnot. And these new landowners would need people to work on the land. Because land wasn't super duper valuable on its own, since there was just so much of it. And oftentimes, the only way to really make money on this land was to farm it, and farm it intensively. Because there's just so much land. Russia is growing so rapidly and taking in so much stuff that being given even a few 100,000 acres of land, where in other places might be like, wow, thank you, oh my god, such a valuable resource. For the Russians, it's like, yeah, okay, everyone and their mom who is part of the gentry has 1,000 acres of land. If I want to do anything with this land, I'm going to need a lot of people. And so that's exactly what the Russian government was facilitating. You can start bringing in all these people to work this land. And not only were there serfs to work this land, there was also indebted servitude. People would sign labor contracts to work on this land. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but that's really important because sooner or later, Russian peasants are not going to have any right to have land of their own. So they would not be able to work their own land. So people would sell themselves temporarily, or sometimes basically forever, into labor contracts so that they could have some kind of income. As well, at this point, landlords were required to serve in the military or civil service. So that means that they're basically never home. And they needed people who legally couldn't leave. They kind of at the beginning, like what we were talking about, is these people are oftentimes not there, and they need people who are going to stay and work the land for them. And these people are worried that, well, if I can't enforce my rules of stay here and work or else I kill you, these people are going to leave. Because, you're not very scary when you're off in some other country fighting a war, or you're off in Moscow running the government. So they're relying on the law to keep these people in place, to keep the serfs from just doing whatever they want. And, well, the Russian government is benefiting off of this immensely. So the restrictions on serf continue to tighten. And the tightening of these restrictions resulted in more or less what you would expect from the Russian peasantry: violence. These people responded with incredible violence, which, to be fair, yeah, why wouldn't they? These people are being told, you work to death or we kill you. Well, if those are my options, I might try to choose a third one where maybe even if I die, at least I don't have to die in chains. And a lot of people did choose that. And this is an area where Russian serfdom and American slavery had some pretty serious crossovers. One being this violence, particularly small-scale violence. Not necessarily large uprisings, though there are some, and we will get to one later. But a lot of it is a serf killing their landlord, or a serf attacking an overseer, much like how you would have cases in the United States of slaves doing the exact same thing. And much like in the United States, a lot of this is covered up because they don't want other people to know about this. If you are in charge of the serfs, you don't want other serfs knowing, yeah, they murdered my brother, and then they took over his farm, and they burned it to the ground. You don't need anyone knowing that. The entire economy is built up on this. So, much like the antebellum South, the serf-having Russians are going, anything that goes on stays really, really tight-lipped. Because we don't need these people thinking they can kill us. We don't need these people thinking they can win. But that actually changes at one point. And while it didn't ultimately result in a victory, the end of serfdom, or really any serious change, there was one revolution that really put the idea and the concern of a serf revolt into the minds of the folks in charge. and this would be the Pugachev Rebellion, which will be the topic of next week's clarifying episode because we do not necessarily have time to go through the entire thing here, but I do need to go ahead and hit the highlights. So Pugachev was a Don Cossack, and he did a lot of fighting. He fought in the 7 Years' War, he fought against Poland, and he fought in the Russo-Turkish War. So while he was doing all this war fighting, he got injured, and he was sent home to convalesce. He spent about 3 years at home, convalescing, getting better, and then he just kind of fucked off into the middle of nowhere. Dead serious. I mean, just got up and walked away. Started just wandering all throughout Russia. And while he was doing this, he spent a lot of time with a group called the Staroviershi. So the Staroviershi, or the Old Believers, is a Russian Orthodox puritanical group who are really not fans of the mainstream Orthodox Church or the Russian government, particularly because they were being actively oppressed by the government. As well, in the year 1772, Pugachev learned about the Yaik or Ural Cossack rebellion and how it was incredibly brutally put down and how the rights of this Cossack group were greatly restricted. And this really kind of made Pugachev mad. And he said, well, I'm going to go fight. I'm going to go join the Ural Cossacks, and I'm going to stick it to them. Unfortunately for Pugachev, he was arrested for desertion and was banished to Siberia. Fortunately for Pugachev, Siberia is really fucking big, and this is a story as old as time. Guy who's mad at government gets sentenced to exile in Siberia, turns right around and comes back, because, well, it's kind of easy to do that when Siberia's 1/11th of the world's landmass. So that's exactly what he does. In June of 1773, Pugachev returns and declares himself Peter III. Only problem is Peter III is Catherine the Great's dead husband, and Catherine the Great is currently in charge. So, Peter III he is not. But, under the name of Peter III, he establishes himself as the anti-czar and decrees serfdom is illegal and calls for the extermination of all the landlords. And, believe it or not, this was incredibly popular. People did not like being serfs. People did not like the religious oppression of the Russian state. People did not like paying heavy taxes for all these stinking wars, and people didn't like being drafted in all these stinking wars. But in spite of his popularity, Pugachev would lose. That being said, Pugachev would take a number of cities, he would have a capital and actually hold court, basically his own government within Russia, and he scared the absolute living shit out of Catherine the Great and all of her gentry friends. People were fucking mortified of the idea of this random Cossack guy and a bunch of serfs and how they may very well put an end to the Russian Tsardom. And in response to this, she sent the entire fucking army to crush this guy. And it actually took quite a bit longer than they would have hoped. Pugachev realistically probably never stood a chance, but he did a hell of a lot better than anyone really expected. Unfortunately for Pugachev, and arguably unfortunately for all those enslaved in Russia, he was ultimately executed in 1774 for, well, you can probably understand why they wanted to kill him. But this really put in people's head that the serfs, they, one, want to, and two, if they are organized, can take this whole thing down. They can bring the whole empire to its knees, and they will put heads on spikes. So people are starting to kind of freak out a little bit. And while Pugachev was the most famous rebellion, again, this was not the only one. So this one just kind of really put it out there. The serfs are angry. But it was not uncommon for serfs to engage in smaller acts of violence. And there would be other smaller revolutions against the Russian ruling class before and after Pugachev. And as a direct response to Pugachev's rebellion was the creation of the peasant courts that were supposed to help check the powers of landlords and allow peasants to kind of air grievances and even potentially sue for their freedom. Now, we'll talk about that more later, but as you can see, the Russian government saw this and went, oh my god, we kind of have to play ball. There's something here where we're not so in control as maybe we thought we were, and maybe these people could really do some bad stuff to us if they wanted to. So they gave a little bit. Now, we will talk later about how what little they gave really wasn't that much, and how they basically immediately just kind of flipped the script and said, okay, we're just back to fuck you guys. But as you can see, it did have some kind of response, and it made people think. So outside of these rebellions, serfdom continued to expand. And what drove serfdom was the expansion of the Russian Empire. The Tsar would acquire more land and would dole out land to the people that they liked. And these lands would come with the people who lived there, especially because, as I said in the clarifying episode, oftentimes these lands would come with a not insignificant amount of people. No matter what land they took, it came with someone. And so the Tsar would more or less just say, congratulations, welcome to the Russian Empire. This guy owns you now. And this guy who owns you, well, technically doesn't own you, he owns the land that you live on, and you just happen to be part of the land. So he's a landlord. And these landlords were literal lords of the land. They had more or less complete control over everything that went on in their space. And who helped this happen and put quite a bit of this into law, which would last basically until the end of serfdom, was Peter the Great. Under Peter the Great, he abolished conditional land tenure, which is a fancy way of saying that he made it illegal for people to choose where they went and what they did. So the peasants were officially property that were attached to the land. So we're here. I've been talking a lot about how people were attached to the land and that they are kind of slaves, but kind of not in just the most obscure sense. Well, Peter has really made that happen. You are now at the complete disposal of the person in charge. They can decide everything you do, down to what you do all day, for how long, where you're going to do it, how you're going to do it. You do not get a say in this stuff anymore. Technically, you are not a slave. They do not technically own you. But you have no decision on what you're going to do to make money. You have no decision on where you're going to do it. And you have no decision on how or how long you are going to do it. And speaking of slavery, Peter also abolished slavery. Well, sorta. He freed all the slaves by just turning them into serfs. Which I honestly think kind of just shows you these people are, in everything but name, slaves. As well, Peter gave full private property rights to the gentry. What that means is you cannot own land unless you are a member of the gentry. And there you go. Serfdom has kind of hit its zenith. This is where serfdom is at its most serfy. In reality, things have more or less been playing out this way the whole time. But now the law says it. The law now says that Russian peasants have no right to own property. They have no right to choose what they do, where, and how. They have no right to move, and they have no control over who it is who controls them. So even the people who aren't serfs are ostensibly serfs. Everyone has to work on land owned by someone else, unless of course you are a rich gentry person. Everyone has no say over where they go, unless of course they're wealthy enough to pay to go to that place. And everyone does what is laid out before them. Again, unless they just happen to be very, very wealthy. And what this also means is these serfs are tied to the land, they are part of it, and so also are their children. So if you become a serf, if you become a servant, your children are now part of that system. This is called generational serfdom. And basically, it works exactly like slavery does. The only difference, and I know I keep stressing this, but really the only difference between this and serfdom is that technically, they do not own you. Technically, you are part of the land, and they owned the land. And well, now they get your kids. There's no way out of this. Once you are in the system, it is very, very hard, nigh impossible, to get out. But not all peasants were serfs. Pretty much the vast majority of them were, but not all of them. At different times throughout the Russian Empire, anywhere from 50 to 80% of all Russian men were serfs. All Russian peasant men were serfs. So, yeah, that again is kind of just the vast majority. If you are not nobility, if you're not gentry, you are most likely a serf. And even if you weren't a serf, you were kind of a serf anyhow. Instead of being a serf for an individual, you were a serf for the government. And this is kind of what I was talking about before, if you work on state-run land. And roughly a third of all peasants at various different times were what were called state peasants. And these were people who were allowed to live on state-owned land and work there. They had very few more rights than a normal serf, but they did have some private property rights. They were allowed a certain amount of ownership, and really the most thing is they just had less oversight. Their landlord, that being the Tsar, wasn't always there to tell them what to do. But when the Tsar was there, or when the Tsar's representatives were there, they had total control over these people. Again, they were ostensibly serfs, but it was, not technically called being a serf. And the government usually just did whatever they thought benefited the government most. And this included renting these peasants out to be serfs to landlords, or just sending them into the military. And so, all that aside, you also had to pay a tax to be there. So, for all of the amazing benefits you get of having a little bit less oversight and basically all of the exact same life, you also have to pay money to be there. The other option for people who were not serfs was to serve in the military. But the military was also kind of just being a serf or a slave. Russian military terms at the time were 20 years long. The vast majority of people who went into the military at that time in Russia died in the military. And part of that is the fact that, sure, you're going to get shot at and you're going to go fight in a war and whatever. But another part of it is, if you join at 18 and you're there for 20 years, you're getting out at 38. That's 38 in the 15 to 17 to 1800s. You're not living through that one, man. It's going to be really rough. Something like 90%, I can't remember, but it's really high, of all people who are drafted into the Russian military would not survive. So you're not a serf, but the government has complete control over you because you're part of the military. So, as you can see, basically everyone was a serf, even if you're technically not a serf. And the serfs were responsible for everything. They were the backbone of the entire economy. Kind of like slavery in the antebellum South, but somehow even more so. Because every person who isn't gentry is more or less owned. And they're either being used to produce money, they're being used to fight wars, they're being used to build public buildings. Almost all of those people, even if they are not technically serfs, are ostensibly serfs. And so, well, what does a serf do? Well, again, if you're in the military, you aren't technically a serf, but you're doing military stuff. If you are a state peasant, you're probably just going to be farming, but could be a number of things. Whatever the government thinks is the best use of your time, you will do that. If you are a serf who is controlled by a landlord, there are 3 types of serfdom. The first one is called corvée. Generally, this is considered to be the least bad kind of serfdom. It has a lot more freedom to move and a lot more freedom for you to kind of do what you want to do. You spent a lot less time in contact with the landlord, and really what this comes down to is you could go where you wanted and do what you wanted, or oftentimes you would go where your landlord sends you and do what your landlord tells you to do, but you just pay a tax back to your landlord. It was kind of common for these people to go to the city or go to other towns and villages and work jobs that maybe paid a little bit more than whatever you might be doing on the farm or at the kind of serf plantation under your landlord, and just send money back. So kind of like the state peasants, you were still a serf, you still have quite a bit of control over you, and you don't really have a lot of say in what you do necessarily, but the guy who gives orders and dispenses quote-unquote justice isn't there. He's somewhere else. So you have a lot more freedom via a lack of oversight. And this was actually a fairly common style of serfdom, depending on where you were. Generally, this would be more common in areas where farming was less profitable. So like if you're in Ukraine, you're working on the farm, because this is just too good farmland. To not have you doing this would be dumb. But if you live somewhere like in the mountains, or maybe you live somewhere near a large city, or maybe you live somewhere where somebody's already producing too much farm produce and you're just not going to be able to break into that market, well, maybe instead you should go to Moscow and work in a factory, or maybe you should go somewhere else and do something else. And of course, this would depend on what you are good at. Maybe, if you, the serf, are very good at a certain skill, great, go do that. Whereas if you're not, okay, you're going to stay here. This was particularly common in places like Siberia and to the far north of Russia, because those places are very cold and very unforgiving. And also, and we'll get into this a little bit later, these were places that didn't really get into serfdom in the way that the rest of the country did. So in the places up there that did get into serfdom, it was quite common for them to send people somewhere else to make money, and well, those people had a generally better life than the next couple folks. So the next kind of serfdom is direct control manual labor. And it's exactly what you think of when you think of a serf or a slave. These are people who tilled the land on the estates of their landlords or worked in factories established on the properties. Which is really kind of nuts when you think about it, that on the one hand, there are so many people to be used kind of at the disposal of the landlords, and that the landlords had so much money that they could invest it in the creation of factories. And they did, because this was a great way to make money. They were a big part of Russia's entire industrial economy, and it was done almost entirely on the backs of serfs. But what's the life of these people like? Well, not great, as you might imagine, because the landlords had direct oversight over their serfs, which meant that punishment was common and it tended to be severe. Though there actually were rules about what you could and could not do to the serfs. Though, as we'll discuss later, those rules were not always followed, and justice was not usually swift or harsh or existent. And a lot of that kind of boils down to, one, a lot of these people who are carrying out whatever they see as a fair punishment against their serfs, they might be royalty. They're at the very least very wealthy and powerful, so the system isn't exactly interested in punishing them, and also they're very far away. Russia's massive, and policing all of it's really hard. Even in the places where it's populous, it's just so damn big, and it's really hard to investigate everything, especially because this is happening a lot. The kind of abuses against serfs are every single day, in everywhere, on a country that's like a sixth of the entire Earth's surface. So it's really easy for people to get away with this, because, well, they're rich, the people they're abusing no one cares about, and it's just a lot of effort. Sometimes there is actual response to this, but it's never kind of in the way that you want. There's not going to be like any arrests or executions of, some very important nobleman is like, you've been abusing your serfs, time to face justice. It's generally just a fine. But for now, back to what serfdom looks like for these people who are out in the field. Oftentimes, these serfs would be working incredibly hard hours and be doing incredibly labor-intensive forms of work. Even more so than normal, since it was oftentimes seen as cheaper to just make your serfs work harder. So of course, anyone who's out farming is going to be doing quite a bit of labor. They're going to be working very, very hard. They're going to be, breaking their back just to make ends meet. Well, in many ways, the serfs were working potentially even harder, even longer hours, because a lot of Russian nobles said it's just cheaper to make the serfs work harder than it is to invest in modern farming practices, to change anything. Why work smarter when I have a basically unlimited pool of people to have do all the work for me who can't say no? And if they do, I can do whatever the hell I want to them. So this actually would become an issue for Russia, and we will talk about this later, where Russia, a big reason why they end up getting rid of serfdom is because they want to modernize the country, and they see serfdom as kind of a block to that, because people are relying so heavily on just, well, we can make the serfs work harder, instead of trying to come up with new and different ways of doing business, farming, what have you. Though, one of kind of the benefits, I guess, though it's not really a benefit, I guess it's just a benefit compared to other kinds of serfs, of these serfs who are out working the land, is they're allowed to grow their own food, and they oftentimes can do other work outside of whatever work it is they need to do for their landlord. And this creates a certain amount of independence and freedom, because they can have their own food supply. They're not necessarily reliant entirely on the person in charge. They can make their own food. They can potentially create their own industries. They can make even some of their own money. Of course, a lot of this is going to end up going into the pockets of the landlord, but realistically what this does is it creates a sense of community, a sense of society for the people who are out there, more so than just, well, we're all working out here together and it sucks, but they can create kind of their own towns, and they do. They create their own villages, which are kind of self-sustaining. And this is particularly important because when things go bad, they can take care of themselves. They're not reliant on their landlord to take care of them. And what's kind of interesting about this, and also I think incredibly bleak, is, like I said, they would make their own towns, because the territory that these landlords would control are massive. Like, when you think of a plantation in the United States, they are large. They are very, very big. But in Russia, these are so big you cannot imagine. These are going to include not one, not two, but sometimes as many as 3, 4, or 5 towns. These are going to be like small states, basically. Like, whole counties are going to be under the control of a single landlord. And here's a really interesting tidbit that I found in Lazar Volin's The Russian Peasant and Serfdom. He claims that in 1858, 3/4 of all serfs lived on a plantation of 2,700 acres in size, which 2,700 acres is already fucking massive. That is a huge amount of land. And mind you, 3/4 of all serfs lived on these very large kinds of plots of land, which means that some lived on larger. But what's particularly important here is this is in 1858. 1858 is 3 years before the emancipation of the serfs. So these 2,700 acre lots, these would be some of the smallest estates that the nobility would have had before the end of serfdom. Why? Because this is right at the end. These plots are being passed down and divided over time due to inheritance. So that means these would have been much, much, much larger, even just 20 or 30 years ago, potentially. So that is the kind of division of wealth we are talking about. We are talking about people who are owning states worth of land and have potentially tens of thousands, 100,000, even million or more people under their control. So when I use the term landlord, like I said earlier, I literally mean it. These are the lords of the land. These are more or less their property, these people. Thousands of them that they have direct control over. And these landlords would go out of their way to do whatever they could to continue to bring more and more people and more territory under their control. And this was a big driver of Russian imperialism. Because, again, Russian Empire means more land, and the Tsar's giving that land to the people that he likes. And more land, more people means not only is Russia going to become more rich and more powerful, but the landlords themselves are going to very clearly and very directly benefit from that by taking in more of this territory and putting more people on it and having them either work in the field, work in a factory, work in cottage industries, do whatever the hell it is they want, and just make them shit tons of money. And as the 1700s turned into the 1800s, this type of serfdom was super, super popular and was making shit tons of money as Russia was expanding very quickly and taking in tons of land, and as Russia was industrializing. And actually, this made so much money that a lot of the corvée serfs were recalled back to the kind of serf manor, I guess, the serf plantation, in order to work in new factories that were being built by these landlords. These were so big, in fact, that by 1803, roughly 42% of all industry was in rural areas, meaning that roughly half of all of the industry that was taking place in Russia was being done on privately owned land via serfs on a landlord's plantation. But these were not the only kinds of serfs. The corvée serfs and the kind of direct in-the-field serfs were only two of the three. The last one are known as manor or house serfs. And these are often kind of seen as the most unfortunate people because they are completely cut off from everything. Corvée serfs are off out in kind of the middle of nowhere doing whatever, trying to survive, sending money back. They're not having a great time of it, but they have a lot more freedom. They have a lot more personal control. The serfs out in the field, they have more control, not as much as the corvée serfs, but they have a certain amount of control, particularly in their ability to create relationships with other serf villages. They can grow their own food a lot of times. They can kind of take care of themselves. They can take care of each other. They have their families. They have a certain amount of community. Manor and house serfs have no one. They can only rely on themselves, the few serfs that live within the house, and whatever kind of goodwill the person that owns them has for them. So they have no connections. They kind of have nothing. If they don't have enough money, they can't sell anything. They're not allowed to go out. They're not allowed to do anything. They're stuck there. If they don't have food, they can't get it. They don't have even the tiniest amounts of freedom that the other serfs had. As well, they had the most contact with their landlords, and they were oftentimes the most punished because they're always there, and they are oftentimes the most harshly punished. And a serf could be punished for anything. And not just the landlord could punish the serf. We will talk a little bit more about the law later, but the legal apparatus that controls serfdom is incredibly important. And the law was very, very keen on punishing serfs who, as it saw, were maybe rebellious or riotous or just not interested in being a serf, who responded negatively to being constantly beaten, berated, and abused. And so serfs not only had to worry about their landlords potentially abusing them, the law was oftentimes used as a weapon. And manor serfs were often the targets, more than others, of this kind of punishment. And when they were punished, they were often punished harsher, because they were seen as, being within the house. They were the ones that the landlords had to kind of look out for, They were the ones that had the greatest opportunity to, say, murder their landlords or whatever. So it was not uncommon for these people to be punished, and punished harshly. As well, this is going to be a very kind of gross next segment, so if you want to skip over that, that's completely fine. I just want to give you a quick content warning that we are going to talk about the sexual abuse of serfs. This is going to be fairly short, but it is an important part of the discussion. So here we go. This shouldn't take but a few minutes. So if you want to skip, please go right ahead. I don't want anyone to have to listen to anything that they are not comfortable with. So, sexual abuse of female serfs was quite common. These people were more or less the property of the landlords that controlled them. Sex was used as a weapon to control serfs. It was used as a punishment for both male and female serfs, as a way of emasculating male serfs and as a way of punishing female serfs and burdening them with a child. This is a very disgusting form of torture and abuse, but it is one that is quite common in serfdom, and this is another important similarity between Russian serfdom and American chattel slavery. Both of these institutions had a built-in sexual assault machine, basically, that was designed to always keep these people, those who were enslaved, those who were owned, under the fear of those who owned them, of those who controlled them. And their sexuality is something that would be used against them. While in America, there is a very racialized aspect of slavery, white people owning black people. Russia was a little bit different. Everyone in this system, theoretically anyways, is of the same race. The reason I say theoretically is because race is made up and stupid, so theoretically, these are all of the same race. But it is not uncommon that people from outside of Russia, and even educated, wealthy people within Russia, would talk about the depravity of serfs, of the Russian peasant, that they were somehow more immoral, that they were somehow less person-like, that they were uneducated, they were gross, ungodly, whatever. And they would use this sexuality that they themselves, that the landlords imposed on the serfs, as a way of punishing them. It was quite common, it was quite brutal, and it is something that is not brought up arguably enough, that the use of sexual violence is something that was central to this form of slavery and was central to the American form of slavery. So, I know that was probably very unpleasant. It was unpleasant for me to read, it was unpleasant for me to write and research, but I did want that to be in there because I think that is very important for us to understand that our own understandings of Russia, that many people to this day still see Russia as a place of debauchery, as a place of not maybe the most solid moral foundness, that this is actually the result of hundreds of years of sexual violence against people who had no chance, who had no choice but to become victims. Because even if they did try to fight back, they would be punished. They could be killed, they could be drafted off to some war, they could be taxed into oblivion, where every penny matters, and where these people could easily starve to death. The threat of even a small financial burden could be enough to destroy the lives of multiple people. So that's what it kind of looks like for serfdom to exist. That's what it looks like on the ground. Which, remember, 50 to 80% of all male Russian peasants were serfs. So what can we extrapolate from that? Well, the vast majority of people would have been serfs. So the vast majority of people would have experienced this system. A system of violence, a system of oppression, and truly just a system of kind of no hope and no end. But there were certain things that were put in place, and this is a chief distinction against slavery, that did give the serfs certain rights. And they were able to use these, and they did, not infrequently. Remember those peasants' courts that came after the Pugachev Rebellion? Well, these were used pretty frequently by the peasants to try and win their rights, to win freedom. Particularly, this focused around two things. One is that the family members, particularly the children of soldiers, could not be owned as serfs. Unfortunately, it's not really for some great reason. It's basically that if you are a soldier, you're property of the government, your children are also property of the government, and one day they will be soldiers. So they can't be serfs. But this was something that peasants would use quite a bit. They would either sometimes invent documentation to show that their children were the children of soldiers when they weren't, or they would work very, very hard to find proper documentation, which oftentimes can be very difficult because, well, the Russian Empire wasn't the best about doing this. And again, it comes down to that the place was so damn big and there were so many people and there's just so much going on. But they would go out of their way to find this information so that they could get their children out of being serfs. But it didn't always work. One, it was hard to get that information. It cost money. That was a big issue, is to get information was expensive, and to take things before a court was expensive. And then, of course, it's kind of an issue of whose word are we going to take here, a serf or a nobleman's? But sometimes it did work. Sometimes people were able to effectively argue for the freedom of their children. And then there is the second issue that serf freedom generally would kind of revolve around. And this is a little bit more complex. So what this has to do with is after a while, the Russian government would put limits on who could own serfs. And if you were in one of these classes that couldn't, a lot of times you would still try to, because there was a lot of money to be made in serfdom. And these people who were not in the kind of landlord class, the kind of serf-owning class, they were oftentimes allowed to rent labor from people who did own serfs. And it was not uncommon for them to just buy serfs from the people who were renting serfs. Because, serfs are kind of a big commodity. There's lots of them, and people will pay good money for it. So it's not uncommon for people who aren't legally allowed to own serfs to buy serfs from people who are not legally allowed to sell them serfs. And if the government found out that this was the case, those serfs could be freed. In 1837, there was a law that said basically that if you were working at the estate or on the property of somebody who was not allowed to own serfs, and then you returned home to your original estate, you could file suit for your freedom. And, well, lots of people did this. So many people filed complaints and petitions that in 1840, the state council just completely reneged on it. So this is what I'm talking about. That there were laws that kind of made it easier for people to get out of serfdom, arguably. There were certain rules in which, if used properly, could get people freed, and did get people freed. But the issue was the people in these courts and the people who were being accused in these cases were noblemen. Some of them were royalty, and they didn't really necessarily care about the serfs. They weren't exactly interested in helping the serfs out. Really, they were just more interested in, again, the paperwork. These courts were more or less just there to give people an outlet so that it could be recorded. And, well, if it ever got to the point that these people had a real claim, well, sometimes they got through. Oftentimes, they didn't. And I think that is kind of a really telling thing about how serfdom worked in Russia. It was an incredibly important institution, and at the end of the day, no one was going to say anything about it, because the people engaged in it were wealthy, powerful, important people, and while technically there were rules and laws about how you could and couldn't treat people, what you could and couldn't do with them, nobody fucking cared, because the institution was just too powerful. And that actually has to do a lot with the ultimate downfall of serfdom. That by the 1830s, people were already starting to kind of think about the end of serfdom. And a lot of it just came down to it wasn't as popular. Russia was expanding into places where serfdom wasn't a big idea. Like, people weren't into it. And a lot of these places would even free their serfs. The problem is these serfs were now free and had nowhere to go because they legally couldn't own land. So it's like, okay, cool. nice gesture, but like not super helpful. But these people weren't into serfdom, particularly places in northern Asia, like in Siberia, and places in the west edge of the Russian Empire, kind of central Eastern Europe. They weren't super into serfdom. They were not intrigued or really excited about the idea, and so oftentimes they just wouldn't engage in it. Or they would release the serfs, or they would pass local laws that were much more effective at curbing kind of misuse and mistreatment of the serfs. But this desire to free the serfs wasn't really acted upon, because at the end of the day, the money's just too good. This is central to the economy. You might have limited, kind of sporadic pushback to it. A Polish lord might say, I don't want serfs, and let all of his serfs go, but that was it. There was not going to be really big responses. And it would ultimately take a very serious change to make people want to end serfdom. And basically what that serious change would be was the humiliating defeat of the Russian Empire in the Crimean War. Now, you might be thinking, what does that really have to do with the emancipation of the serfs? And actually, it has quite a bit to do with the emancipation of the serfs. Basically, what happened is Russia goes into the Crimean War and gets its ass absolutely handed to it. Like, they lose big time. And the Tsar, his government, and a lot of other people within Russia kind of come to the table and go, we need to change Russia. That's why we lost. The Russian society is kind of stagnant. It's not really pushing forward. There's not a lot of new ideas. There's not a lot of progress being made. And so they decide we need to do something or else Russia is going to fall apart. And this is the kind of kick in the pants where people start to say, okay, serfdom, while it is incredibly lucrative and it is incredibly good for our individual well-being, it is maybe not as good as the alternative. There can be more. There should be an alternative to this process. And that's why serfdom comes to an end. It has nothing to do with an overwhelming feeling of camaraderie with the serfs. There's no awakening to the idea of, oh my God, what we're doing is evil. No. The people in charge ultimately say, it would be better for us if we ended serfdom. It would be better for the economy. It would be better for Russia if we pulled the plug on this and moved on. So, that's what they did. On February 19th, 1861, Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs. His plan was these people would go out into Russia as a new, invigorated, I guess just kind of interested Russian populace who are going to change the face of Russian industry and Russian society. But that's not the case. For one, these people who are being freed are desperately poor, and they're going to continue to be desperately poor. And two, they're not educated. They don't have access to any of the kind of legal mechanisms of power that they would need to, say, influence Russian society. There's not a lot of writers and poets and musicians or machinists or mechanics or people who are going to be causing real big changes in the Russian imperial system. The vast majority of these people are going to be dropped off kind of, at the end of their term as a serf and told, now you go figure it out. Who cares what you do? You're not my problem anymore. And that's where most of them find themselves. In theory, a lot of these people were supposed to come out and have land. They were supposed to have opportunities. Alexander promised the serfs their freedoms and their own land that they would be able to operate once they'd been liberated. This land was supposed to be taken from landlords and distributed to the serfs. Each serf was going to have kind of, 40 acres and a mule, in much the same way that after the passing of the 13th Amendment, they were supposed to be the doling out of property and opportunities to freed slaves. But much like after the slaves were freed in the United States, this did not really kind of turn out. So the first issue that this plan suffered was each serf would have to be tallied. And from that, the amount of land that the landlords had to be tallied. And then they would have to decide, okay, now that we have this many people and that much land, here's who gets what, how much, based on, well, this guy's in this area, so the land's better or worse, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And this process took decades. And while this was happening, the serfs would have to stay on the land of their landlords and continue to pay rent with their labor. They were not allowed to leave because, well, they couldn't go anywhere. Again, it's not about freedom, it's about control. It's not about concern, it's not about wanting people to be safer or whatever. It's about the fact that the Russian government doesn't want you to move because it's easier to count you up. So that's exactly what happens here. The serfs are not allowed to leave, and so they have to stay put. And, well, they're staying on the land of these landlords, so the government says, well, just work for them because you are taking up their land. Well, what does that sound like? Sounds pretty similar to the system of sharecropping seen in the US after the emancipation of the slaves. And once the serfs got their land, this is where things get absolutely nuts. They had to repay the landlords for the land. So most Russian peasants spent 1861 until the revolution in 1917 in a form of debt peonage. They basically just went back into serfdom. So Alexander's whole idea of, well, we'll release the serfs and they'll bring with them these new ideas and these new prospects and this new blah, 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 and a more open and forward-thinking Russian society is nonsense. Because the instant these people hit the ground as free people, well, immediately, well, you got to start working for your landlord, not as a serf, but you got to pay rent, man. And then once they are free of their landlord, they're actually allowed to own their own property, well, you have to pay these people back. Well, how the hell are you supposed to do that? So, you're just a serf again. At the end of the day, this didn't work. The vast majority of people that he freed continued to live in abject poverty, and Russia would continue to be inflexible, autocratic, and unwieldy. And this is ultimately kind of what begins the downfall of the Russian Empire. Alexander sees the issues of what's going on here. He sees Russia being too kind of stiff. It's not able to adapt. It is suffering from a similar issue that people point out with slavery in the United States. That for everything else that you can say about it, if all you are interested in is making money and kind of, building the country, slavery's not even good for that. Slavery is a stupid system that is horrifying and evil and doesn't even kind of fulfill the most basic, simple, stupid ideas of what it's supposed to do. It doesn't even drive the country forward, which, to be fair, I'm not sitting here saying like, oh, wow, that's the real issue with slavery. No, there is no redeeming factor to slavery. Slavery has nothing good going for it, and this is the smallest reason that it is bad. Truly, the human cost is the worst, but for those people who are out there, then and now, who go, well, slavery at least was some kind of profitable economic system. It fucking wasn't. And much like how the South ultimately fell the fuck apart because it couldn't produce, it couldn't keep up, it couldn't compete, Russia had the same issue. And Alexander correctly addressed that, and not from some place of care, not from some place of concern or empathy, but from a place of just very cold calculating, wanting to make Russia a more successful and robust place. He released the serfs, and they did literally nothing to help these people, which also sounds very much like the United States after the collapse of the Confederacy and freeing of the slaves. So, what was Alexander's legacy? He freed the slaves. He put a bunch of very, very poor, very, very disgruntled people out into Russia who had centuries worth of trauma and distrust for the wealthy, particularly those who owned land, who had a history of violence against these people, and who had very little prospect, whose very existence on this earth, despite being told they were free people who could choose their own fate, was still absolutely dictated under the threat of financial ruin and state oppression. So, Alexander absolutely built the bomb that would ultimately destroy the Russian Empire. Or, well, that's not entirely fair. He did not build the bomb. He placed the fuse on the bomb. If the Russian aristocracy was right about one thing, it was that slavery and serfdom and all of this entire system, would ultimately be their downfall. But they were too greedy. They were too blinded by their own ambition to do anything about it. And Alexander, like I said, he didn't build the bomb, no. He put the fuse, he put the wick, the last final piece, so that somebody could take a match to it and blow them all up. Ironically enough, do you know what happened to Alexander? Alexander was murdered almost exactly 20 years after the emancipation, by an anarchist terrorist group outside of the Church of the Spilled Blood in St. Petersburg. He was murdered March 13th, 1881, just a few days short of 20 years exactly after the day that he released the serfs. This would be a legacy that Russia has not shaken, and to be fair, it shouldn't, much in the same way that the United States should not shake its legacy of slavery. But, as I said at the beginning, serfdom is not something indicative of Russian culture. Serfdom is not something indicative of the individual Russian. Serfdom is not something that we can point at Russia and say, well, look at them, they're a bunch of backwards heathen monsters. No. Serfdom was a mechanism of control levied by a small group of incredibly evil people against the population of a country that to this day is still being held accountable for a system that they did not institute, a system that they were victims of. The average Russian today is the descendant of people who were owned as property up until the 19 teens, as people who were seen as little more than fodder for, you name it, cannons, crops, mining, whatever. So let us not now, in the year 2024, continue to perpetuate these kinds of stereotypes and perpetuate these myths. Let's instead talk about the history of Russian serfdom and the damage that it caused, and the hundreds of years of trauma that has been imprinted on millions of people all across the entire Eastern European world, as well as much of Central Asia. This is a system that had millions of people, tens if not hundreds of millions of people at any given time within its grasp, and the effect of which has continued to be seen on economics, politics, and particularly perception outside of Russia. So let us try to move past that. Let us continue to understand and talk about the legacy of serfdom while also understanding that this is not some kind of inherent feature of Russian society. This is not some kind of inherent facet of what makes the Russian people. Instead, let's treat the Russian people and the people of all of Eastern Europe and Central Asia and anywhere else that may have been subject to this system as what they are, as individuals who come from different societies and different cultures who cannot be put into little boxes and who cannot be remembered for an atrocity that was done against them, not one that they themselves committed. So I think that's probably enough grandstanding for this one episode. I know this one was a little bit serious. It wasn't particularly fun or funny, and I mean, that's by design. This is not supposed to be a fun episode. I think this is a very interesting episode, and I do hope that you all enjoyed it and learned something. And I promise you soon I will get back into more kind of light-hearted, interesting stuff. But serfdom is something that we have to talk about. It's an incredibly important facet of the Russian Empire and is something that we still see certain echoes of today. Like, for example, it is still not possible to travel between different regions within the Russian Federation without an internal passport. This is something that was instituted during serfdom as a way to control the people within Russia. It is still being done today. So it is important to understand serfdom in order to understand Russia, as well the kind of issues of anti-Slavic racism and kind of just dumbing down the Slavic and Eastern European, Russian, whatever experience is something that really bothers me. So I hope you will indulge me this very depressing, very kind of serious episode, and I promise you I will bring it back to something a little bit more fun and lighthearted in the future. But for now, thank you for joining me in this particularly long episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys will stick around for the next one. I hope you all are having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.